Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Again, poking my head up from paternity leave because Syria fell. And who better to talk about this situation than Kamran Bokhari, who joins us on the podcast to give us his insights. As you can imagine, he's pretty busy. I could hear his phone going off as we were talking, but I really appreciate him giving us an hour of his time to talk about these developments. As you all know, I've been a little out of it lately, so in some ways, I was playing the role of listener more than I even usually do, because I know that Kamran's been following things closer than I've been able to over the past couple of weeks. If you have questions, comments, concerns, anything like this, you can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. This was recorded on Friday, December 13th. How ominous. It'll be out on Monday or Tuesday. I doubt that much is going to change that impacts the conversation, but if you feel or see any inaccuracies, it might be because we had to wait 2 or 3 days to put this out. So hope you're all enjoying the holiday season with the people that you love. Cheers and see you out there. All right, Kamran. I'm again popping my head up from paternity leave because Bashar al-Assad decided to collapse. My first question for you: I certainly didn't have this on my bingo card for the end of 2024. I don't know a single analyst who does. Did you have any sense of how brittle the Assad regime had become, or like me, were you sort of not taken aback by the brittleness, I should say, but taken aback by the timing? I was not expecting this to happen now and in such quick succession.
It just sort of depends on how you want to sort of frame this question in terms of timeline. You might recall that at Stratfor, circa 2015, I wrote a series of pieces on what the geosectarian conflict looked like, the future of it. And there was one piece I wrote that there are serious limitations on the extent to which Iran's influence in the region is going to expand. And I basically said, eventually this will contract. Now, that was 9 years ago. Then in 2021, I talked about this issue of a Turkish Iranian confrontation that's building up. But I said that for that, the Turks have to be able to push into Syria. And when that happens, in 2021, it wasn't clear. But when Hezbollah got hammered by the Israelis, and when Iran's entire proxy network and Iran itself got hit directly, and Iran was put on the defensive on October 3rd, which was, I guess, weeks ago, I basically said that this is an opening, that I don't see how the Turks and their Syrian rebel allies will pass up. So I did, and then I wrote a couple of follow-on pieces explaining what that looks like. And when it happened, when Aleppo fell, I said, "Oh wow, I said something useful that actually is panning out." But to be honest, just like the Afghan collapse in 2021 in 9 days, I think it was a roughly 9 or 10 days in terms of the Syrian collapse as well. That was fast. That did take me by surprise, but understandably so, because if you have taken Hezbollah out of the mix, the Iranians are in disarray, and Assad is essentially something waiting to collapse. Then it does make sense. The timing does make sense, but then of course we also have to factor in that the Turks and HTS and the other smaller rebel groups, they were in place. They were prepared to take advantage of this opportunity. You just don't steamroll down from Idlib into Aleppo and then on your way to Damascus.
Yeah, which is a perfect lead into sort of the questions that I think we have to talk about first, because the nerd in me wanted to ask you about pre-Ba'athist Syria, because my knowledge of Syria really begins with the Ba'athists and the Cold War. Like, I don't really have a whole lot in the brain for what's going on, and I'm sure that you do. But before we get there, um, who you already mentioned sort of the Turkish-backed rebels, but they're not all of the same stripe. So there's this group Tahrir al-Sham, you called them HTS. There's the Syrian National Army. There's so many different groups that are running around here. And it seems like HTS is the one that really led the vanguard here. And I know that they've had some Turkish military support in the past, or at least they've had dealings with the Turks in the past. But my understanding was it was the Syrian National Army that was really the front for the Turks. And is HTS really, should that be seen as the Turks pushing? Should that be seen as, oh, the Turks have backed this general, nexus of rebel groups, and one happened to push through, and their relationship with Turkey might be more ambiguous. I know that HTS, there have been reports that they've promised security for Russian military installations already, so maybe they're going to be more pragmatic. There's also, lurking behind HTS is its history as an Al Qaeda affiliate, or was it an Al Qaeda affiliate? And what is its current relationship with Al Qaeda? So, all of that is to say, I know we've got a whole alphabet soup of groups here to deal with, but in as simple as a way possible, who are the rebels? Who are the people that are leading this charge? And who are the people, at least first in line, to pick up the pieces of a broken country?
So again, and a lot of people on Twitter sort of get express irritation as to why I'm making comparisons between the Syria of the here and now and what has transpired in Afghanistan in years past. But there are parallels. There are obvious differences. HTS isn't the Taliban, and vice versa, and Syria is not Afghanistan at all. But there are parallels in terms of how groups emerge in battle spaces and how regimes collapse, and that strategic vacuum is then sought to, different stakeholders try to fill that vacuum. So if you go back to the 1992 collapse of the Marxist regime in Afghanistan, you had 7 rebel groups, along with legions, tens of thousands of Arab and Muslim insurgents from overseas that the Americans, the Saudis, and the Pakistanis had put together to oust Soviet troops and then, essentially collapse the Marxist regime. In '89, Soviet troops withdrew. The regime held on its own for 3 years, probably would have held on longer had the Soviet Union not imploded in December of 1991. The regime still hung out for a few months, but by April, it was clear that the regime was going. Now, that regime collapsed. That was the last, if you will, semblance of anything called a Afghan state. Since then, there hasn't been an Afghan state. It's been, one regime and then another. The vestiges of the modern state essentially fell in 1992 and haven't been resurrected since. Why am I saying that? Is because I find it hard to believe that all these disparate groups, and then not to mention the minorities of whom there are many, and then the Kurds, I'm talking about the Arab minorities, Christians, Druze, Shia, Ismaili, Alawites, and then the non-Arabs, the Kurds, who hold, who enjoy or have been enjoying de facto self-rule for about a decade in the northeast, and then they fought with ISIS and gained more territory further south in eastern Syria. I have a hard time believing all of this will come together, and I think that this is just too early. This is sort of that interregnum right now. There's euphoria. Assad is gone. People are celebrating. But once it comes down to power sharing, they're going to fight. Now, that's exactly what happened in 1992. It actually happened much quicker because all the groups descended on Kabul, and then those groups went from fighting the Soviets and their Marxist allies to fighting with each other. There was a 4-year intra-Islamist civil war, and from within that came out a group called the Taliban, and they eventually, pushed aside everybody else and became the dominant faction. Took a long time, but my point over here is that process may not play itself out in ways that look similar to the Afghan experience, but there is a template there, and we'll just have to sort of gauge it. I use it as a benchmark to gauge progress in one direction or another. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is infighting. I would actually be surprised if there wasn't, because then that's just too good to be true, at least at this stage. So I think that an HTS. I mean, there's a lot of focus on Jolani, whose real name is Ahmad al Shara, and his group. First of all, Jolani is very young. He's like around 40. I don't know exact age off the top of my head, but that's very young. And as you mentioned, Jacob, he's gone from being Al Qaeda to ISIS, then back to Al Qaeda, and then sort of throwing the whole transnational jihadist enterprise aside and saying, I'm my own group. And that journey from transnational jihadism to nationalist jihadism, and now to sort of Syrian nationalism, that's just too fast. That's like we're talking a period of what, a dozen years, and as someone who sort of studied the mechanics of ideological and behavioral transformation for my dissertation, I can tell you that this is sort of one of those things that is an anomaly. What does that mean? The questions are, how many of his associates and how deep does this metamorphosis go within the group? Are there differences within the group as to what they will do? We don't know. We will have to see. Then, how will they share power with other rebel groups? You mentioned the Syrian National Army. There are other groups in the south and the south east along the border with Israel and Jordan. There are the Kurds. What about bringing in? There 40% of all Syrians are from those minorities, both Arab and Kurdish. What happens to them? So there's a lot that can go wrong here.
He's an interesting character in his own right, and I don't know how much to emphasize him because, as you say, or at least to extend your metaphor, it sounds like you don't think HTS is like the Taliban. You feel like HTS is just one of a number of rebel groups that, over a period of years, is probably going to go through a crucible, and some kind of group will emerge out of this. But Jelani himself, I mean, his chosen name comes from the Golan Heights because he comes from a Syrian family that was displaced from the Golan Heights in the Six-Day War. His father was an Arab nationalist who sort of backed the Nasserites in Syria. He was imprisoned by Hafez al-Assad. Jelani himself is born in Riyadh, is not born in Syria, but comes from this sort of tradition. And also, I mean, sort of curious to see, Israel saying, "Hey, we're going to put troops on Mount Hermon and in these different parts of the Golan Heights because we think we need to." So the very area that he came from. But so, do you think it's too much to focus on him as an individual player, or do you think that he's somebody who's going to be a big part of the transition going forward?
So look, he's positioned himself well. He has risen from within that complicated milieu of Syria, where we had dozens of rebel groups. It could have been any leader who could have emerged, but this is the guy who's kind of like the last man standing. And his group is a survivor of that uprising. It also survived the defeat of the rebels in December of 2016, when Aleppo was retaken by the Assad regime forces with heavy support, close air support from Russia, and ground mobilization of militias by Iran and Hezbollah. Uh, he managed to hold on to this piece of territory in Idlib, not the entire province, but a good chunk of it, and establish governance there for his group. His group then edged out, began fighting with those elements within the group that were still wanting to be part of Al Qaeda. Those guys went into another group, or this other faction called Horasuddin emerged that was more Al Qaeda than HTS. Mind you, HTS used to be called Jabhat al Nusra, and then it became Jabhat Fateh al Sham, and now in the last so many years it became HTS as Hayat Tahrir al Sham, which actually the name does not the name is very secular, if you will. It does not have any reference to anything Islamist or religious. Tahrir means liberation, and Sham is Levant or Syria, and Haya is sort of like this association or group. And so this is anomalous. I do also want to point out, you do not grow and develop into the Jolani that we know of today and the HTS that we know of today on your own. You have to have help, and it was very clear that when the head of Turkish intelligence, Ibrahim Kalin, who I personally knew at some point, in the past when he was a student here in the United States, and he came very symbolically to Damascus, prayed in the Umayyad Mosque. There are videos of Jolani driving him around. Both men sitting in the front of a sedan, and being driven around. You don't do that if you don't have this all planned and gamed out. The head of Turkish intelligence does not just sort of show up unannounced. There's a lot of prep work that needs to go. And you have to be able to have the trust that when you go into this sort of chaotic place, that people aren't going to, kill you, if you will, or you won't, because there's chaos. There could be, the American troops were withdrawing from Kabul, and ISIS, staged a massive suicide bombing. So these kind of things happen, but for them to show up shows that he was groomed by the Turks, and not only by the Turks. It's well known he's also been groomed by the Qataris. So he's had help. I think that if I had to sort of say, his ideological and behavioral transformation uh, is something that obviously isn't like hasn't been forced on him. It's organic, but it also has a lot to do with who taught you, who groomed you, who provided you with the circumstances. In other words, Ankara and Doha, they've had a huge role to play in this sort of evolution. Because I remember in 2015, Jelani did his first ever interview, and I don't think he showed his face on Al Jazeera. And he first came out on a major, international network saying, "We're not terrorists. We're not, Al Qaeda or ISIS. Actually, we're actually fighting those guys. We are, religious. We are Syrian. We want to liberate our country from the clutches of Iran and Russia." And the Assad regime, and et cetera, et cetera. So this has been a long time in the making, at least I would say 10 years.
Hmm. Um, we know who the losers are. We know that this is a big problem for Iran. We know it's a big problem for Russia. Obviously, the Assad regime, a big loser. Are Turkey and Qatar the winners? Is this, do you think, what Turkey wanted in the end, or is this situation something that they can't really control and that it will get beyond them? It seems to me that this is very much in Turkey's interest, and that the long term trajectory here is a Sunni Arab power that will look to Ankara for leadership. But a lot can happen between now and sort of that eventuality. So, would you characterize Turkey and Qatar as the winners here, or are there any winners to think about?
Definitely, they have won this round. This is, the way I phrase it is just like the Turks were able to punch a hole in the Russian sphere of influence in the South Caucasus by backing Azerbaijan in its war with Armenia. The Turks have finally, after many decades, punched in a major hole into actually a critical hole in the what used to be the Iranian sphere of influence. My God, it's happened so fast. Now we're you calling it used to be. For the longest time, I used to speak of it in the present tense, and so they've punched a hole, and now the situation is so. First, yes, Iran uh, Iran needed, before this happened, Iran needed to stop the hemorrhaging of Hezbollah, needed to be able to make sure that whatever has happened, the devastation in the war with Israel, would not lead to Hezbollah becoming weaker on the home front, i.e., in Lebanon. Now, the Assad regime is gone. So helping a battered ally has become extremely, excruciatingly difficult for Iran. Not only that, the new reality that is emerging in Syria threatens the Iranian position in Iraq with the Shia dominated government there because of the cross border Sunni demography, Sunni Arab demography in eastern Syria and Western Iraq. Mind you, this is the same real estate that ISIS conquered and established its caliphate from Raqqa all the way to Mosul. And you and I worked on that quite a bit back in the years, uh,
Intimately.
intimately. So the Iranians know this. The Iranians are wanting to hold the line in Syria. And the problem that the Iranians have is um, the by defeating ISIS and ironically, we're being on the same side with the U.S. and taking Mosul, the Shiite militias that it mobilized in 2014, those Shiite militias have dominated these Sunni Arab majority areas in Iraq, and has created a geosectarian, if you will, grievance to say the least. The Sunni Arabs obviously wanted to get rid of ISIS, but the cost is that they're now under the domination of Shiite militias supported by Iran in their own territory, where they represent a numerical majority. For them, this is sort of like an event that may embolden them. And right now, it's too early, but eventually, the Iranians know which way the wind is blowing. So I think that this is what the Iranians are doing. Now, as far as Turkey is concerned, Turkey, they say be careful for what you wish for. And so I think Turkey has had sort of what is called catastrophic success. And now comes the hard part. The hard part is, you can't be at odds with Russia and the United States at the same time. With the United States, there's the incoming Trump administration, and the Turks are looking at this and saying, Trump doesn't care about the Kurds. All he cares about is ISIS. If we tell him we're going to fight ISIS and we're going to manage Syria on your behalf, you don't want to be here anyway. So let us do the heavy lifting, and we'll do it for you. So they're a bit more optimistic there. But with Russia, Russia is saying, we're not going to give up Tartus. We're not going to give up the air base. We may lose it eventually, but we're not going to give it up without a fight. And we need to work. You're our partner, so we're going to work through you. Today, there's a report that a senior Russian official told Reuters that, hey, we're in contact with HTS and the new emerging authority in Damascus for negotiations on how our facilities will remain secure, which basically means we want to keep them for the long haul. Uh, I have a hard time seeing that HTS can accept that and then not look bad on the home front. Uh, because the Russians, the Syrian population looks at Russia as having given sanctuary to a man who essentially murdered them in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and displaced millions of people. So Russia, they see Russia as having blood on their hands. So that's going to be challenging. But Russia will not work with HTS. That's not the principle. The principle is Ankara, and of course Doha, the Qataris. But in this case, the Turks will have to work some arrangement out. That's going to be tense because keep in mind that the Turks are now filling a vacuum that the Russians are leaving behind. They're doing. I mentioned South Caucasus. We now see Syria. We're already seeing, what's happening in the Black Sea basin with Ukraine and everything, and then there's Central Asia as well, where the Turks are trying to emerge as a player through their organization of Turkic states. So that's a broader dynamic that the Turks and the Russians have to sort themselves out. How does it manifest itself in Syria? We have to see, because this could become threatening. The Kurds are not going to go away, if you will. So the big question is, how does Erdogan and the Turkish state have its cake and eat it in terms of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish-led movement that is that is controlling a large amount of territory in the northeast and east? Well, there is the Iraq model. You can sort of divide and conquer. You can work with the Barzanis and to counter the Talibanis, the KDP and the PUK. KDP will help you against the PKK. Something similar will be tried in Syria. Then there is the federal structure model, let's say, and that's where it gets really tough. Because if you remember, and I'm sure you remember, Jacob, that the federal structure of the Iraqi state that currently exists, it's not great, far from it, but it's still there. That was built by the United States. Obviously, in negotiation and working with proxies of the Iranians, the Shiite groups that form a majority in that country, but the Kurds were part of it. The Kurds got a KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, but they also were brought into the central government. So the president of the country has been a Kurd. Foreign ministry was with the Kurds. Can the Turks bring the SDF and its constituent groups into a federal structure and say, we won't want you to have this self-rule area. You will have, some autonomy there. And then they're also going to take advantage of the tensions between the Sunni Arabs southwards from the areas near the border of Turkey and Syria, and say, okay, let's use the Arabs to counter the Kurds. Let's also see if we can buy some partners here. Can the Barzanis help us across the border from Iraq? But ultimately, push, and they'll expand their buffer zone. They want them away from the border. You can have your self rule. I'm just laying out the Turkish strategic plan. Not saying it'll work, but this is their strategic plan. Now, the problem with this formula is it assumes that there will be something robust in Damascus. In Baghdad, you had heavy US presence, military, and the US literally put the Iraqi post-Saddam state together. US is not getting involved here. This is going to be a Turkish show for the most part. They will have to deal with the Israelis who are in occupation of now Mount Hermon and other parts northeast of the Golan Heights. You will have to sort of somehow say to the Saudis and the Emiratis that, hey, we're not bringing the Muslim Brotherhood back, even though we're working with HTS, which makes you really, really uncomfortable. They will have to make sure that the Iranians are kept into the box. They will have to bring in the minorities into the group. So without a structure, without a robust architecture, how can you absorb the Kurds into a centralized state and then not have them become a self-rule area that threatens you and basically emboldens the PKK on your side of the border? This is the same problem that the Americans had in Afghanistan. The state that they built for 20 years and spent $1 trillion was not strong enough to be able to bring in the Taliban and say, be part of it. Let's have power sharing. Uh, I think something similar is going to happen here.
Yeah, I mean, Turkey already has a little bit of a better track record here because, I mean, I remember when the Obama administration was talking about their program to train Syrian rebels to fight back against Assad, and they spent how many billions or hundreds of millions, and that they trained like what 55? They found like 55 rebels or something like that who went through their program. It was an absolute disaster. You anticipated some of my questions there, but I want to stick on the Kurds a little bit because to me they're sort of the linchpin here, or they're the biggest problem. I would have thought that Turkey just wanted to obliterate them and wanted to get rid of autonomy in the first place. I also would have thought if you are Iran or Russia and you are looking for some way to push back here, also if you're Israel and the Saudis, if you're looking for something to check Turkish power, the only piece on the chessboard are the Syrian Kurdish groups, because if you can arm them, and they are very good fighters and they are very motivated, they fought ISIS, they didn't get autonomy for not being good fighters. They've got all of their cousins in southeastern Turkey. You've mentioned the PKK. Like, if you can really start stepping on that, um, Turkey's controlled a lot of what's going on in the northern KRG and has been active there. That's a place where Iran can maybe push its Shiite militias to come further north and maybe consolidate control. Is it crazy to think of the Kurds as sort of getting that groundswell of Iranian or Russian or even Israeli support? Or do you think it's actually feasible that Turkey wants to work them in and is not just going to, not tolerate their existence?
So there are two stages. By the way, this is an excellent observation from you, Jacob, that the most important piece on the chessboard are the Kurds. And yes, absolutely, every single actor that you just mentioned has an interest in working with the Turks. Because look, the Saudis and the Iranians, I'm sorry, the Emiratis and the Israelis, uh, and we haven't talked about Jordan and Egypt, and we can get into that later, but all of these actors do not want a situation where they just got rid of the Iranian influence to then just have to deal with a Turkish dominated Levant, or at least Syria. So it's a difficult, impossible situation. So you're going to have to do something. The Russians have some relationship, with the Kurds. It remains to be seen what they can do, because they will be struggling on in Western Syria. So how big of a role can they play in Eastern Syria remains to be seen, but they will have some input, as far as I understand. The Iranians definitely want to use uh, the SDF as a lever to try and keep the rise of Sunni Arab actors on the Syrian side of the border. If they're tied up, with um, fighting the Kurds, then they're less likely to come and embolden things in Iraq. So yes, there's an incentive there. The Saudis and the Emiratis would love to be able to do business here. The question is, what can they offer? Um, and at the end of the day, can any of these actors uh, do something more than what the Americans have been offering to the Kurds? And if the Americans are saying, we're leaning towards Ankara because we don't want to get into this. I'm assuming this is where Trump is going. I have no idea if he's going in this direction.
If
Uh,
he follows through on his first administration, that's where he's going to go. I mean, I got in trouble at one point for calling what I thought a spade was a spade and saying Trump basically abandoned the Syrian Kurds, and I see no reason why he wouldn't do that again. He wants to have a better relationship with Turkey.
yeah. So if that's going to happen, then what are these other actors going to do? If the United States has sort of set the tone and enabled the Turks with an upper hand in the battle space, and then what are these other players going to do but in the beginning there's going to be some military we're going to see some military dimension of this. So yes, they're going to come in and push the SDF and slice and dice the area that it's holding, but eventually there has to be a political solution, and I guess that's where I was headed, because this is a significant demography on the Syrian side. You just can't just sort of like get rid of them. You have to cut them down to size if you're the Turks, but eventually you have to incorporate them in some political dispensation. And I said that's where the hard part is, because the core of that dispensation depends on the HTSs and the Sunni Arab armed factions. And if they can't have a power sharing agreement, then how do you bring the Kurds into that? And before you bring the Kurds into that, what about the Alawites? What about the Christians? What about uh, the uh, the Shia, the Ismaili, and the Druze? So this is going to be the challenge of Turkey. That's why I keep saying it's right now round one. The current round they've won it, but this could all blow up, in their face at a time when they're going through significant turbulence, both politically and economic and financially, on the home front. So let's see. I mean, it's going to be a test of Turkish statecraft.
Um, let's sort of move on there for a second. I mean, if there was ever an opportunity for Kurdish nationalism to rise, like now is really the time. There's a big opportunity here. But I also sort of assumed in my question that Iran would be able to push back. That Iran, having been defeated in these areas, is going to fall back on its strength. But as you've pointed out, we've got President-elect Trump incoming. We've got his previous talk of maximum pressure against Iran. We've gotten, you've said previously that you think the Iranian regime is pretty sclerotic and brittle, and that it wouldn't take a whole lot to push it off of the edge. Um, you also talked about how this began with Hamas, and then it was Hezbollah, and now it's Syria. Um, are there more dominoes to fall here? Is this going to put pressure, say, on Jordan? Can the United States use this to put pressure on Tehran in some meaningful way and try and bring down the regime there? Do you think this is contained inside of Syria, or do you think that we're going to get more contagion sort of in some of these bordering states? Because it's striking when you see how the shock lines have gone out from Gaza and are just rippling and knocking actors down one by one.
And there is a reason why the head of the IRGC-QF, Ismail Khani, is in Iraq today, talking to the Iraqi militias and the Iraqi government. The media reports say they're talking about Israel, but what they're really talking about is their ignominious, let's say, withdrawal, defeat in Syria, and the implications of that. Uh, Look, I think that, as I said, the Iranians will try to draw the line on the Syrian Iraqi frontier. They don't control that frontier because it's a cross border situation. It becomes sort of a singular battle space very quickly, as we've seen in recent years. So here's something that I want to sort of I want to go out on a limb and say this might happen. It's provocative, but I could see it happening because the Iranians are under so much pressure. They've lost so much so quickly. They need to be able to sort of have a counter. And it's the following: I could see them deploying military forces in Iraq to defend that country. They could go and have a relationship with the Iraqi government and say, Syria is dangerous. Uh, you guys are vulnerable, and we are all vulnerable. You could use help, and I would be willing to bet that, given where the geosectarian fault line is right now in the region, it wouldn't take much heavy lifting to persuade Baghdad and all those Shia stakeholders in Iraq to agree to this. That would be a major move on the part of the Iranians to say, sure, we lost Syria, you know, we're on the downswing in Lebanon, Hamas is gone, but we're drawing the line, and here's where we are. That sets up a fait accompli, where you basically say, you know, this is Iraq. And then that gives them some bargaining position with Trump, because ultimately they know that they have to deal with him on the nukes. They have to deal with, and all of this is happening while Iran is undergoing internal transition. Look, Khamenei is dying at a time when his country's empire is crumbling and his regime is dying as well. So this is a very complicated situation. So there's a lot of commotion in Iran, but it could be one of those things that they might do to sort of counterbalance and say, and it would be huge. They've never deployed their forces beyond their borders. This is something they've always sort of claimed with pride, that we do not invade other countries. It's the U.S. that does it. It's the Israelis that do it, and we have been the target of invasions for ever and ever on our western flank. Uh, am I saying they're going to actually do it? I have no evidence. It just makes strategic sense from where I'm looking at. Can they do it? I don't know.
Well, and the other side of what you're saying is, I mean, let's say that Khamenei does die in the year ahead, and let's say that there is factional infighting. There have been reports that young IRGC cadres are furious about the abandonment of Hezbollah and of some of these other groups. Like, man, I mean that makes the situation even better for Turkey if you've got an Iran that is literally self-combusting. There is one pawn on the chessboard that we haven't talked about quite yet, which is the Houthis, and which is ironically the group that has the most global impact because Red Sea shipping is still shut down because of what they're doing there. I was sort of thinking that we'd see shock and awe from the Trump administration early on to knock the Houthis out. Where do you think Iranian support for the Houthis go? Do you think that Yemen is part of this picture at all, or do you think it sort of gets pushed to the side?
That's a great question. And before I jump into that, I just want to close the loop on my previous thought by just sort of pointing out that what we are seeing right now with the Turkish Iranian competition heating up in the Levant uh, isn't something new. It actually isn't even something that the Ottomans and the Safavids came up with. This goes back to circa 1000, during the time of the Seljuk Empire, when and since then, a variety of Turkic powers have been battling with Persianate powers for control over the Arab world. And this is that latest chapter. We're in a moment where, in many ways, what the Iranian regime did over the last 40 years was unprecedented. It was always the Turkic powers and Sunni powers that dominated Mesopotamia and the Levant. What the Islamic Republic did was akin to what the Sassanid Empire did, which is pre-Islamic, is that they controlled Mesopotamia and some parts of the Levant, and they were battling Byzantium for centuries over control over that. So I do want to point out this long arc of history, that this isn't something that's completely untethered from the past. So having said that, now let me shift gears to the Houthis. The Houthis are a key player in the Iranian so-called axis of resistance. But I suspect that with everything that has happened, the Iranians will advise the Houthis to hold their horses, so to speak, because it's one thing to mess with the Biden administration and then have a few airstrikes here and there. Um, it's another thing to take that risk with the Trump administration that eliminated Soleimani, and you know, with that whole maximum uh, pressure policy and strategy. So I think, and if you're the Houthis, you just saw uh, the group that you model yourself after, Hezbollah, get shattered. So you're asking yourself this question: what chances do I stand? Yes, the Israelis are too far away from me and much closer, and therefore they were able to easily deconstruct the Hezbollah architecture. But still, we're messing with the United States, not with Israel, when we hit commercial shipping, and so we need to somehow find a way to survive. Um, but again, if history tells us anything, the Zaydis, the Houthis, are the current elite of the Zaydi community in Yemen, in northwestern Yemen. Uh, but we know for centuries they kept many powers at bay. They, kept the Ottomans out of Yemen for 200 years, from the mid 1600s until like the late 19th century, and it was too late for the Ottomans by then. But the point that I'm making is the Houthis see themselves as wanting to survive. This is not a moment to be aggressive anymore. This is a moment in which to consolidate and work with Iran, and I think that that's going to be their play. Um, it all depends what the negotiation will be between Tehran and the incoming Trump administration. Yesterday we had that news from Reuters that incoming President Trump has appointed an envoy for Iran in the form of Richard Grenell, which he then very quickly said, no, the story is wrong, but he didn't offer any details. So one is wondering what's really going on. Uh, so from an American point of view, you got to deal with the Turks, you got to deal with the Iranians, you have to deal with the Russians, and then there's Saudi and the UAE. Uh, but if you don't want to do the heavy lifting, which the Trump administration doesn't want to do, then you will find ways. This is going to be an interesting deal. I mean, there's an imbalance of power, and has been, in the region, between the four principal players. Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. How does the Trump administration keep every one of these does it deal with every one of these actors, is going to be very interesting, because interests diverge very sharply and in a very complex way between these four different poles.
Yeah. We've danced around the Saudis a bit, and the Emiratis by extension, but maybe we should just spend a few minutes on them. I mean, what is this good from the Saudi point of view? Is it bad? Is it just is, and they're going to have to sort of move around it? I would think that they would feel threatened by Turkey moving further south, and that might give even more impetus for closer relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, because both of those countries will be made nervous by Turkish power moving south in that way. I also know the Saudis have, given Turkey a financial lifeline. As soon as Erdogan won his election, there he was with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and cashing those checks. And maybe Saudi Arabia feels like it has some measure of leverage over Turkey in some meaningful way. And if you can hurt Iran, and if you can get a Sunni power, Arab power rising, then maybe you don't have to deal with Israel at all. Maybe this is just a world in which Saudi Arabia and Turkey can shake hands and agree on something. Where do you see the Saudis in all of this?
So the Saudis are, for the most part, saying, "Oh wow, we got more than what we ever could hope for," Iran is gone from the northern rim of the Middle East. It's still in Iraq, but we lost that battle when the U.S. toppled Saddam. So okay, that's the cost of doing business. But hey, look what happened to Hezbollah. Look what happened to Assad. This is great. The Iranians have been pushed back into their box, so they're celebrating. But like I said earlier, they're worried about the Turks because bear in mind the Turks are now emerging as sort of leaders of what is Sunnidom in the Middle East, at least. And they know that the Turks are a bigger player than they are. And so they don't like where this is going. And then there's this, who are the Turks operating through? An Islamist group. And not just an Islamist group, a Salafi group, which is sort of the ideology or was the ideology of the Saudi regime until MBS decided to, adopt or chart a secular course for the kingdom. And that's a work in progress. So they're really worried about that. They're really worried about Turkish domination, the use of that Syria and the Levant is going into the hands of something that's a cross between the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis. It's a weird one, and we'll just have to see. Can they be pragmatic? Sure. Look, the Emiratis became pragmatic. It was their rivals, the Qataris, who helped the Taliban come to power. But who got the contract for Kabul airport? It was the Emiratis. And the leader of the former Haqqani network and current interim interior minister, Sirajuddin Haqqani, he has a photo op, with the MBZ in Abu Dhabi. So if the Emiratis can play with Islamists, then this whole idea that they're completely allergic to Islamists uh, is needs to be revisited. And so, is there space in which Golani and the HTS's so-called moderation uh, is an opportunity for the Saudis and the Emiratis to play ball with them? Yeah, but then the competition for who controls HTS begins. Is it Turkey? Is it Saudi/UAE? We just have to see. So yes, they do have that leverage that you talked about. Is that Erdogan needs cash, and so that could be a way for the Saudis and the Emiratis to insert themselves and make sure that their interests are secure. And so they have leverage. It's just that Turkey is an actual military power. These guys are not, and they're further afield. They don't have a direct border. Uh, the Saudis also want to make sure that whatever happens in Syria doesn't spill over into Jordan. Jordan is under a lot of pressure from the Iranians in Iraq, from the West Bank situation, and the Israelis creeping towards annexation or at least taking over large parts of it. They already have 800,000 Syrian refugees, and then it's a weird place, Jordan. There's parliamentary life there. There is a kingdom. There is the Muslim Brotherhood. There are all sorts of other actors. So and more than half of all Jordanians are from Palestinian background. So that's and it's a monarchy. And the Saudis uh, want to make sure that whatever happens, that argument that they've had since the Arab Spring uprising is that, oh, Arab Spring uprisings happen only against these sort of secular Arab nationalist, autocratic, dynastical, personality driven regimes. These are vertical states. The monarchies are far more embedded in the fabric of society, and we are not this sort of autocratic regime. And look, monarchies haven't fallen. So they're worried about that. And then switching gears here, talking about, you know, autocratic Republican forms of regime, there's the 800-pound gorilla in the region, which is Egypt. And yes, the Saudis have put in, and the UAE has put in tens of billions of dollars. And the Egyptians got a whopping $15 billion total bailout package, including the IMF is $11 billion. And so they've kicked the can down the road. But what we have is a situation where, look, Syria fell. Syria was very similar to the Egyptian regime, Arab nationalist in both two different flavors, Syria Baathist, Egypt Nasserist. They were one country from 1958 to 1961 called the United Arab Republic under Nasser. Fell apart, couldn't be held together, but you got to wonder, the Egyptians are wondering, is, is this Arab Spring 2.0? They can't assume that everything will be okay. I'm not saying it's happening, but these are things that are on the minds of the Egyptians and by extension, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. So the Khaliji Arab powers have their work cut out for them.
Yeah. I mean, the rapidity with which Assad fell, it's not likely to be replicated in either Jordan or Egypt because, as you pointed out, like Jordan's institutions are much more robust than the Assad regime's institutions were at the end. Same for the Egyptian military. That said, you're exactly right that both of those situations seem precarious. I mean, you talked about Jordan's demographics and everything else. On paper, Jordan doesn't make sense, and eventually, those realities are going to come home to roost. Egypt's already had the first chapter of this with Arab Spring 1.0. There's no reason to think that that might not happen again. Although there's arguably no country that stands to gain more from neutralizing the Houthis than Egypt, because they need those Suez Canal tolls to start coming in again. So maybe they'll have some interest there. Kamran, I know we have to get you out of here because I know you only have 5 minutes left. So I want to give you a chance to sort of wax historical or philosophical or however you want to do it. Um, I was struck when you were talking about a power Sunnidom, Arab Sunnidom, not wanting to go from just Iranian influence to Turkish influence. But of course, that is the story of Islam, that a Muslim power rose in the peninsula, and then within a couple caliphs, the Umayyads had taken over, and that Damascus and this area became the real center of the Islamic world, and eventually moving on to Istanbul and Turkey. And so I wanted to just ask you, is there any optimism for you about the future of Syria? Because I mean, this territory from roughly Damascus to Aleppo historically has been some of the most culturally effervescent, powerful, wealthy portions of the Middle East. It's also a part of the Middle East that if you control that portion of the Middle East, usually you can become an empire inside of the Middle East as well, because it is so critical. It's sort of the mirror image of Iraq. And if you can put those two sides together, suddenly you're in a great position there. All of which, if I was an Israeli strategic decision maker, I would be quaking in my boots right now. Like, this would not be a very, like, in the vein of careful what you wish for. Okay, maybe you've neutralized Iran to a certain extent. You might not like what comes afterwards and what you've kind of helped bring to pass. But is there any part of you that thinks that Syria's diversity might become a strength, that we might see a return to some kind of democratic republicanism or pragmatism in this part of the world, and a rebuilding of the commercial center in Aleppo and of Damascus and of all these great things? Or is it really just consigned to be, part of this broader Turkish, Iranian, American, Russian competition that has ground so much of the region into dust for over a decade, and looks like it will continue to do so? I'm looking for any silver lining that you can offer me.
So look, I never say never, and I am sort of one of those optimists in the very very long run, but that sort of exceeds my own lifespan. So and so it's hard to imagine something that goes beyond your lifespan. But yes, look, Syria. Here's a group that has gone in such a short period of time from being with AQ ISIS to being sort of this mainstream Syrian group with, albeit with a heavy tinge of Islamism. Uh, but yeah, I mean, can they develop representative rule? The Turks can help them with that. But
Well, and maybe I might even ask, because I know that that you're an expert in this too. Like, Arab nationalism is dead; it was discredited. How long until Islamism is dead and gets discredited? And is there an ideology, some kind of unifying ideology, one that is more secular or more progressive with a small p, that brings this part of the world back in to the modern world, rather than in its sort of post-colonial religious sectarian back and forth? I mean, is there anything there on the horizon, or is Islamism still what's going to motivate these actors?
so I think Islamism has Islamism isn't alive. Islamism itself is is a contested notion now, or has been for a long time. There was a fascinating book in 1994 by a French scholar of political Islam. It was called The Failure of Political Islam. His name was Olivier Roy. And it was 1994, long before anybody was interested in this stuff. And he was very prescient. He basically said, look, this ideology doesn't have staying power because it doesn't offer anything in terms of an alternative to governance. There is no alternative governance model here. It's an ideology of protest. I would say it's an ideology of the insurgents. That when you're fighting something, it helps you band together and build a force to fight against the status quo. Once we've seen it over and over again, once it gets the particular group in question to a certain point, it becomes a problem because that group cannot graduate from the realm of ideology into the realm of public policy. And so maybe, HTS can do that on a micro scale. They have governed Idlib. Again, governing Idlib is very different from governing Syria. And then, we're talking about an age of connectivity in the world. And, this youth is very different and far more globally connected than any other previous generation. You've rightly said ideologies. Arab nationalism is gone, and I'm saying Islamism is all but dead as well. Only manifests itself as an insurgent ideology. The Taliban know what they're struggling with right now. They've had catastrophic success as well. So, but it's not going to go away. It's a struggle that has to play itself out. It's a multi-decade, multi-generational struggle. But look, can Syria? There are still kingdoms in the Middle East. There are still republican autocracies in the Middle East. There's some semblance of electioneering and some parliamentary life in Iraq. We see that in Lebanon. Can we see it in Syria? Can Syria somehow do this on a small scale? And I'm pretty sure that that's terrifying for the monarchies. And so there are powers that don't want to see this, don't have an interest in seeing this happen. And then how do you bring sort of that really complicated, hyper factionalized confessional landscape with so many different religious and ethnic groups all across the Levant, to function? Look, we've had the example of Lebanon from 1990 onwards. There's a government that is not effective. In fact, it's the opposite of effective, and so there isn't a political economy in Lebanon, but they did develop. There's a parliament. There are elections. Does it amount to much? No. There was still Hezbollah with its militia. Can Syria somehow go beyond that because it has a similar confessional landscape, demographic landscape? Perhaps, but there's a lot has to happen before we enter into that period of, we're looking at conflict in the rear view mirror and more struggles to govern and people talking about livelihood, and we move from hardcore old style geopolitics to, for lack of a better term, geoeconomics.